Hey, everybody. Welcome to a special edition, episode 61 of Real Hawk Talk. This is Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter at HawkBlogger, obviously on Facebook as well, /HawkBlogger, and on the website, hawkblogger.com. So we are going to be recapping what was a very eventful Seahawks draft. And we talked to you earlier this week, had a lot to cover. A lot of what we talked about ended up happening. Some of it didn't. Some things were the same, some things were different. So we'll go through that. There's also some implications of what's going to happen next, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Before I introduce the fellas, I want to remind folks, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the site. It should be an easy click, simple click. It'll get you notifications either when we have new episodes and go live. It'll also notify you when Cable Thanos, also known as Josh Cashman, posts new videos that he's creating. And really, really excited to announce that both Josh and Will from Rain City Theory series are going to be taking on production of the pod going forward. So they'll be posting it, hopefully getting it up like clockwork within 12 hours of when we're done recording. And doing some additional stuff like creating some clips, sharing those on, and some highlights, sharing those on social. So folks that might miss a little bit can get a glimpse of what went on. So really excited to see what those two do. And when Josh posts new videos on the channel, you'll get notified of that too. So please subscribe. And if you don't subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on your favorite podcasting thing, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, any of those pieces. And to get in early on this next year of being a HawkBlogger patron, patreon.com, patreon.com/HawkBlogger. Okay, now let's introduce the fellas. We'll do it in the order of which they arrived today. Evan Hill in Arizona, taking a break from poolside to come in and talk Seahawks. How are you doing at Evan on HB?
My legs are burned as hell, but I am super ecstatic about this draft. I think we had so much fun this weekend, and I think everybody just feels like I don't know about you guys. We can talk about more about this later, but I've never felt so positive coming off a draft. So I'm super excited to discuss it.
Agreed. Next, from his palatial estate up in the north, real Jeff Simmons on Twitter. How you doing, Jeff?
I'm good, man. I'm currently at my parents' house, so if my internet goes out, it's clearly a computer problem and not my internet. So then we'll learn the basis of the problem.
Interesting. I like the troubleshooting that he's narrowing down the issues. Nathan, I see you frowning a little bit at the potential that Jeff is going to troubleshoot his internet that way, and I see your technical brain kicking in. But I do want to thank you for coming back, maybe even a little bit early from Spokane to make the pod. Hopefully it was a good trip across the state. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. This worked out good. So no rush coming back or anything like that. Had a good trip back. And my frown is because I'm troubleshooting my own technical issues over here, but I think I'm good.
All right. Very good. And you can find him at NathanE11 on Twitter. So fellas, last we talked, we went through a lot of our predictions, and the Seahawks had 5 draft picks when we last talked. They had just traded Frank Clark. They had the 21st and 29th pick in the first round. They had, I believe, a 3rd round pick, a 4th round pick, and a 5th round pick. They ended up making 11 choices, including turning the 21st choice into 6 selections. So let's start there. Evan, what was your reaction on day one? Take us through the progression on day one when that first trade was made and they turned 21 into 2 4th round picks and pick number 30. That first trade, what was your reaction and where did you end up as the days progressed?
To be quite honest with you, when I saw the initial compensation of 2 4ths, I was actually kind of bummed by that. I thought dropping down 10 spots in the first round and only acquiring, the 30 and then the 2 4ths and comp seems a little bit weak. I kind of wonder how many trade partners there must have been for that spot, just because I feel like the compensation would have been a bit stronger if there were multiple people bidding for that spot. But nevertheless, they slid down to slid down to 30 and ended up having, back-to-back picks before they moved back again. But there was one later pick that I was actually more encouraged by, or one later trade that I was more encouraged by. I don't remember which one it was, but they picked up a third or something. But that first round slide was kind of weak, honestly, in terms of compensation.
Yeah. Nathan, I'm curious. I know you're a big fan of trading down. How did you feel after that first trade, and were you when did you start really turning around your perspective on what the Seahawks were doing?
Yeah, I mean, the first trade was a little underwhelming. I mean, we had spent a lot of the time Wednesday talking about, drops down 10, 15 picks and talking about picking up an extra third or an extra second. And obviously they just get the 2 4s. I was happy they did it. I thought it was the right decision, but it did, after a couple weeks of fantasizing about what they might be able to get from a big trade down, it was a little underwhelming. But then, you see the picks that come off the board, and a lot of those guys I didn't think were guys Seattle would be interested in. I didn't think they were guys that I wanted Seattle to be interested in necessarily. So, I don't think they hurt themselves a lot, and they got a couple extra picks, and they just kind of kept that ball rolling.
Yeah, Jeff, one of those names that folks were interested in, at least on Seahawks Twitter, and I think some folks on this podcast were happy to see him not go to Seattle, was Montez Sweat. Talk about the team passing on him and passing on some of those other players that went between 21 and 30.
So one of the things I learned from doing my mock draft after the Clark trade was there was a possibility that there would be that run on defensive ends. And that's what kind of worried me, and why I mentioned Collier on our show on Wednesday, because there was a clear tier drop-off at some point if they all start to go. And what happened was with the Seahawks, Cleveland Farrell went way earlier than he was supposed to go. He's a guy I could have seen as a Seahawks target at 21, and he went 4th overall. And I think that started a domino effect where all the offensive line got pushed down, and it kind of screwed up Seattle's board. And it's kind of why they probably seemed a little ticked after the draft. So Sweat was the one guy that fell, and it's always seemed like there was going to be one who would. I thought it would be Rashawn Gary, and that personally worried me. I wouldn't be surprised if Sweat wasn't even on their board. And I know Seattle's kind of a risk-averse medical team. And I know the way they've handled Malik McDowell and the way they've done some things in the past. I can't say this for sure, but wouldn't be surprised if he wasn't on their board at all. So passing on him to me seems like something that might have been very easy for them. Well, for us, a guy like that with that kind of talent looks like a miss by them, considering they got kind of like a 2nd round player. But to them, I bet you he wasn't even in consideration.
Yeah, I admit that the first you guys can mute. I think we're getting a little feedback. When they made that first trade back, 9 spots and got 2 4th rounders, it was exactly what I expected to happen, which was they got to 21. They didn't have the players that were creating enough demand for the Seahawks to get a really good deal for that pick, and they took the best trade available. And that trade, I know there's a bunch of different value charts, and we can debate that. I don't think 2 4ths is worth moving down 9 spots in the first round. I thought that was a pretty disappointing return on that initial trade. Now, when they took that and then flipped it again for 3 picks, and I think the really critical trade was when it was I think it was the 3rd trade. I have to go back and find it, but it was when they pull it up here, when they turned the 37th pick. So they turned the 30th pick, they turned that into the 37th, which was a 2nd round pick, 132nd, which was a 4th, and the 142nd, which was a 5th. The big trade is when they turned that the 37th pick, that early 2nd round, into the 47th and the 77th. That was a 2nd and a 3rd. When they turned that 37th into a 2nd and 3rd, now the Seahawks went from having a couple players in the first 100 picks to having, I think they got up to 4 due to that trade. And I think that was to me when it really turned around, and then they were able to do more in terms of moving up and moving down. But all told, I was I was sweating passing on some of those players at the initial trade. Not anymore. Not when I saw them get the 6 players they got. Not only the fact that they got 6 players. I said this on the blog I read this morning. There's an evaluation of whether the players are good or not. We're going to get into that, and it's all just guessing right now. But in terms of getting value for your selections, I don't know how you could get more value out of the 21st pick than they did. So I give them huge kudos for what they did there. I think that made their draft, quite honestly, what they did with that pick. So let's keep talking about that for a second, at least the haul that they got. The players that they took that with the trades resulting from that pick: Marquise Blair, DK Metcalf, Ugo Amadi, Ben burr-kirven, Gary Jennings, Travis Homer. Evan, of those 6 guys, who's got your attention?
Honestly, we're not really spending a lot of time on him because his body isn't absolutely jacked and he doesn't look like Godzilla, but it's Marquise Blair. Like, I'm really, really excited about Marquise Blair. I think going into the draft, safety was a huge target priority for the Seahawks. Obviously, Tedrick Thompson hasn't played up to expectation. Bradley McDougald is really the only player that we can count on in that position. Delano Hill is still a little iffy. His status is up in the air, but Marquise Blair is really a player that I think brings a lot of power, hungriness, anger to his hits. And if you watch his highlights and his breakdowns and the scouting reports on him, he's a beast. Like he hits people like Cam Chancellor, and he can cover well and he can tackle well. And I think he has some versatility that I think the Seahawks are super excited about. But Pete Carroll did mention that he wants him playing down in the box. So I almost wonder if they said that they were going to start him at strong safety. So I wonder if this is kind of early to project, but I wonder if week 1 of 2019, it's Bradley McDougald at free safety and Marquise Blair at strong safety. I could really see that being the case. But I'm really glad they targeted the position, and I think he's a stud, and I think he is a little underrated. So DK Metcalf is exciting, obviously, with Russell Wilson's deep ball ability, but Marquise Blair is definitely the name I'll be watching.
Yeah, that was a surprise one for me. I love they got a safety, and I love the style of Blair. I feel like their bigger need is at free, so I don't know if that was just their best safety overall on the board, and they went for the guy that they believe can be a starter. But I think Bradley McDougald's a little bit better at strong than he is at free. But yeah. I was pretty happy to add a player like that. Nathan, you had some thoughts there on Blair?
Yeah, no, I love Blair. I think I'd agree that he's maybe the one I'm the most excited about. All the same sentiments, a little bummed that they don't see him more of the free safety right away. It is something he did in Utah, so it's something that he could grow into. And I do think it makes sense to start him as a strong safety. But yeah, his tape is just incredibly fun, big hitter and stuff. So he's one of my favorites in this class.
Jeff, what about you? Out of all those guys, a little interesting that both Evan and Nathan go for Marquise Blair. DK Metcalf was mentioned, but it was not the guy that they picked. So how about you?
To me, it's not even Metcalf. It's the other receiver, Gary Jennings. And I missed one of the pods this year. I was in Texas for a bachelor party, if you guys remember. And when I was there, I was at the West Virginia, Texas game. And Gary Jennings he just jumped off the page to me. He made the last second touchdown to win the game. So I remember that guy's name going through the whole draft process. I thought he was a guy who fit for them really well, like end of day 2 or early day 3. And I thought after they took Metcalf, they weren't going to go double receiver. I thought they'd address maybe another pass rusher. And when they took him right away to start day 3, I was really jacked up. I think he's a great fit for them. He's a little more polished than Metcalf. And initially, I read your article today. Initially, I thought he might be a slot guy, the way they think it's going to be outside. And now you have his speed outside. He's a little more polished than Metcalf. So when you have those two guys as potentially your outside receivers to pair with Lockett, that's a really, really fun group. And we've been talking about the need for receiver for so long. And to get two guys who are speedy and can make plays down the field, it seems like they are going to start passing more and they are going to start building around Russell, which is things we've all been clamoring for months. And to get two pretty good receivers, to me, was really, really exciting and really showing progress from a team that really looked like they were going nowhere a month or so ago.
So overall, was that your favorite pick, Jennings?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Metcalf one was the most exciting just because it was a big name. They traded up. I liked Collier, but he's not the kind of guy that's going to get you really excited. He's just like a solid player. To me, that was the one. Maybe because I knew him. Maybe because I had kind of hoped he'd be a target if they didn't go receiver early. To double down on that really shows that it seems like they're making progress and they're going to build around that deep passing game and the play action game. And to me, I'd say that's my favorite pick.
Yeah, I got to go with Metcalf. I mean, I think the fact that the Seahawks got a player who, from a physical profile perspective, they just haven't had a guy like this. I mean, I think there's not many guys like him around, and his potential is pretty high, and I think his ceiling is extremely high. And I love high ceiling players. You know, like I know that it's all a bit of a gamble, but I think even what he can do well now, even though he's a bit of a raw player, which is runs in a straight line really fast and jump over guys or outmuscle them, that fits in exactly with what this team likes to do on offense and into their play action game. And I think that can get him on the field pretty quickly. And I also do think the fact that he's going to be a good blocker, I think he could potentially be an interesting player if they choose. I don't know how much he did it in college, but if they choose to hand him the ball around the end, like that's a big dude. Like, and he's going to be moving fast. So I don't know, from an agility perspective, maybe that's not his strength, but I'd love to see them get him the ball. He is a guy that I wouldn't mind seeing, you know, on a wide receiver screen and see him just bowl through some people for a little bit, maybe break it for longer. So excited to see what he brings. Evan, so I was asking before just about your favorite player from the haul they got for the 21st overall. What other players? I mean, what other players stood out to you as you went through the draft? We haven't talked about LJ Collier, for example. I mean, first round, the only first round pick they made.
The one player I'm actually like low key super excited about is John Ursua. I think, is that how you say his name? Wide receiver from Hawaii. He's like a really shifty slot. I almost said slot corner, but slot receiver. Where his number one ability is basically route running. He's an extremely efficient, proficient route runner. And he was somebody that Seattle was targeting in the later rounds, obviously with Doug Baldwin potentially, retiring and ending his career. I think the void at receiver is very clear. And like how many players did they draft at receiver? They drafted 3 receivers this draft. That just hammers, the point home that the area is a clear position of need for them. And, they even went so far to say that, they traded like a 2020 6th round pick for him. So that was the only pick they traded from 2020 to move back into the 7th round. And it sounded like, based off some reports and what reporters were saying, is that he had a lot of interest from a UDFA perspective. So I think somebody said even like 15 teams were interested in him. So for Seattle to move up, and trade a future pick for him shows that I think there might be some potential there. We never know with these later rounds. We saw Chris Carson from the 7th round the year before, David Moore the 7th round the year before too. I think he has the potential. Let me put it this way. Obviously, when you talk receivers, like projecting into the NFL, you always talk about them producing a lot in college. But other than that, I'd say like the number one skill that a lot of people agree on that translates to the NFL is clean route running abilities. It's something we saw with Tyler Lockett and so many other receivers. So for that to be like his number one skill is encouraging and interesting at the same time. So he's somebody we should definitely be watching in camp.
Nathan, I'm curious how you felt about Collier. Is that the guy you looked at all? I know that I want to go talk to Jeff too, because Jeff had mentioned Collier in give him kudos for mentioning him in our pre-draft show. Thoughts on him?
Yeah, he was someone that I thought Seattle was really interested in. They'd been linked to TCU for a long time. He was a guy that I felt pretty strongly was in play for them. I like him. He's a little underwhelming for a first round pick. He's a power guy. He's a 5-tech, not a pure edge guy. Didn't test particularly well, so there's maybe some questions about his ceiling, kind of. But he's like a lot of these guys in this draft, he's tenacious. He can get after the quarterback just by bullying offensive linemen, and he's got a big motor. So I think he's got a good shot at being a good player. I think the thing that'll be really interesting to see is how he does when he moves inside. It's not something that TCU, for whatever reason, asked him to do, even though he kind of has the build and skill set for it. TCU has a kind of a little bit more of a unique and a very kind of they seem to have pretty specific roles for their guys that Collier maybe didn't really fit in, so there's that aspect of it too. I think he got a chance to do it a little bit more in the Senior Bowl and looked pretty good doing it. So if he can be, a productive pass rushing 5-tech on, early downs, and then slide inside and be, a productive interior pass rusher on pass rush downs, then I think that really kind of boosts what he is as a player, how valuable he is. But even if, the interior stuff doesn't really work out, he's a good player. He's strong. He's, like I said, he's tenacious. So a little underwhelming, but a good player and someone that they clearly like. I definitely believe that they felt strongly that he was, their type of guy.
Yeah, Jeff, I think what happened there, my read of it is, I don't know that they saw him as a first round talent either. But I think that they went to their typical approach. We talked about this before the draft as well, that they saw a run on defensive linemen and defensive and pass rushers in general in the first round. And they saw a pretty steep cliff between Collier and the next possible guy. And they saw other players, positions where there's more depth. So what do? They use their pick to take the best from what they saw as a thinner position group before it really cliffed off to the next group, and then ended up getting some guys that some people, like if they drafted Metcalf in the first round, I think there might have been a very different reaction from people. So I think they ended up getting value, but I think they got it in the way that they know how. So what are your thoughts on the Collier pick?
There. When I was prepping for that mock draft the other day, I even do this when I'm planning for fantasy drafts, kind of like the tier players based on certain groups, and just to kind of see where the tiers really drop off. And I knew if there was a run on defensive end, there was a big drop off at one certain spot, and that was the Collier range. And a lot of people thought that they wanted Jerry Tillery. I'm not sure about that. I don't believe that is true. I know Brady Henderson shot it down when I think Davis was tweeting that out the other night, like it was a matter of fact. Brady shot that down. So Collier kind of was the last guy. And then if you looked at the receivers and you looked at the safety, which we all identified as needs, and clearly so did John, which was one of the biggest positives of the draft, there was a lot of receivers left and there was a lot of safeties left. So I'm guessing the guy like Harry from Arizona State had a much higher grade than Collier. But if you looked at the number of receivers left, it was astronomically bigger compared to defensive end, where it was pretty much about to jump off a cliff unless they like that edge guy from Michigan, Winovich. He was the last guy left. So just from a value perspective, I know it's not your typical first round guy, but it made sense why they went there and passed on the receiver, though. Imagine we were all a little underwhelmed that Harry went to New England and they traded out that pick. But from their board, it kind of made sense, and they were right to assume that because there was a giant drop-off. But I think why Collier is kind of a weird first-round pick is he's different than the kind of guys Seattle has identified in the past, especially at that spot. He's not an athletic freak like a Bruce Irvin or a Frank Clark, where those guys are really sparked up. Those guys are like dynamite rushers off the edge. Collier's more of a power player, as Nathan just said. He's more of a bull rusher, and he doesn't have that crazy speed, crazy athleticism. So he's not the most exciting player, and that speed is such an advantage in Seattle where you can get that quick jump. So he's not that kind of player, maybe that dynamic athlete. Seattle always goes for that big upside guy. I think a lot of people have come up with a Michael Bennett. I know Nathan shot that down, so I dug a little more into that. I think Nathan was kind of right. I think Trey Flowers might be a better comparison, the guy from New England who just got paid $17 million. He's not the most like electric edge rusher. He's more of a power, take on bodies, push people around. He took a little while to develop, and I think that might be a better ceiling for him. I don't know if that's realistic or not. He just got paid $17 million, but Collier's game is kind of similar in terms of style, more of a bull rusher, more of a power guy. Because we're used to having that athletic guy, but when a lot of people were mad that they didn't take Harry and they took him, I totally understood it. And the fact they were able to get Metcalf in the second round, the end of the second round, kind of proves that they did read the board correctly.
Yeah, but you end up with Jennings as well. So I think you got two pretty intriguing receiver prospects, and then you've got Ursua at the end. Well, three of those guys, I think they've upgraded that position in a way that the Seahawks have not upgraded a single position in a draft in I can't think of how long. Like, I mean, obviously Russell Wilson was a single pick that upgraded that position, massively. But when you're talking about a group of players in a position that's more than one player, they've tried in the past, and we'll see. The guys obviously have to prove it. But you've had the John Moffitt and James Carpenter drafts.
They got Cam and Earl in one draft.
What's that?
They got Cam and Earl in the same draft.
Right. No, they definitely did. And so I think they got Byron Maxwell in that draft as well, if I'm remembering right. Either that or that was next year with Richard. But in any event, interesting that they triple dipped there, and I think that's pretty of note. But the Collier one, let's talk about it for a second. I mean, one area that they didn't address in this draft that we all thought that they were going to try to was edge rusher, and I think that Collier, I'm bullish on Collier. No pun intended. I think he's got a lot of violence to his game, and looks like he's going to be strong both of hand and of core strength, and I think the Seahawks know what to do with players like that. High motor, has some real talent. So I'm high on him, but he is not a Leo. Like that's not what he profiles to be, and that's what Frank was fulfilling that role. I don't think any of us believe Jacob Martin is ready to step in as a Leo and hold up against the run and do what he has to do there as well. So you got Rasheem Green as a guy that could possibly do that, although I don't know that Rasheem really profiles as a Leo, classic Leo either. He's a little bit heavier and he's a little bit more of an interior rusher. So, my conclusion is that and I think everybody's is now, that we pretty much know that they're going to go heavy into free agency, come May 7th. And there's some meaningful names. I'm kind of curious, Evan, do you have, anybody but after this, but we've talked about Ezekiel Ansah, we've talked about Ndamukong Suh, we've talked about Nick Perry. There's a pretty long list of names on there. How would you feel if the Seahawks ended up signing Ziggy Ansah and Nick Perry? Like if they added two vets to that pile, how would that change your perspective on that part of the team?
Yeah, well, it would definitely feel much more solidified since they only took, one edge rusher in the draft. So they're really kind of hedging their bets on who they have in Rasheem Green, Jacob Martin, and of course, LJ Collier. So even Quentin Jefferson is in there, Jaron Reed. They've got some names, but I would feel a lot more confident, that the group is at least mediocre if they added a couple names to the mix. Obviously there's Ansah, there's Andre Branch who hasn't signed, Michael Johnson, Bengals. I'm just looking at names. Deion Jordan, did he re-sign with the Seahawks?
Nope.
Does anybody know?
He's a name that's come up a couple of times, but if you wouldn't mind taking a look, like from a cap perspective, where the team currently stands with where this will look like with counting for some of the picks, and also some of the news coming out around potentially Doug Baldwin retiring, which we can touch on a little bit.
Yeah, no. So heading into the draft, before like any players were selected, we were sitting at like 26 million in cap space, open cap space. That's not accounting for rookies or IR or anything like that. That was, taking Frank Clark off the books, which was like 17.5 million. So we jumped from like, 9.5 to 26. After the draft, I wouldn't assume that all those players will make the roster. So we're probably talking like subtract like 5 to 6 million to be super, super conservative for rookies. So 26 down, 5 to 6 million, 20 to 21 million. That's how much money we're working with. Ansah is probably like 10, 11, 12 million. I would guess. Maybe I'm overshooting it, but I think he's got a lot of talent that's just hinging on that shoulder. You mentioned Doug Baldwin. So Doug Baldwin, if we cut him pre-June 1st, he's scheduled to make 13.1 million this year against the cap. If they cut him, it's 6.3 million in dead money, and it would be 6.8 million in savings. So, like I said, accounting for rookies, we're at like 20 million in cap space, which is more than enough to, I think, add a few pieces, even expensive pieces, to the D line. And if they cut Doug Baldwin, then it would open up an additional 7 million. And there's also even been speculation that, they'll move on from Mingo or Jerron Brown. Cutting Mingo would open up 4.1 million in cap space. Jerron Brown would open up 2.75 million in cap space. But I think the number to really keep in mind as a fan is after the draft and after the Frank Clark trade, they're working with about 20 million in cap space, and it's a good number. They can, they can pretty much compete for anybody who's left on the market. So they're in a good position.
Important thing there is that between Mingo, Brown, and Baldwin, you're talking about flexibility of another like
10 million. Yeah.
Right. It's 4, 3, and you said 6 for Doug.
Yeah, 6.8. Yep, math is hard. You're right. Like 12 to 13.
You're talking about 13 million and 13,
yep.
14 million, something like that. So then you're up to like 35 million in cap space. That's a lot of cap space for them to then go after. I assume that they're going to do something with Jerron Reed and maybe with Bobby Wagner. But something, Nathan, that some folks in the chat are bringing up, I'm curious your point of view on. I have mine. They're like, hey, why not go out there and trade for Jadeveon Clowney? What's your point of view on that?
It seems like if we're going to praise them for trading away Frank Clark, that then turning around and trading for Jadeveon Clowney is maybe not the right move. It all obviously depends on compensation, but let's not do what the Chiefs did and trade away your one guy just to trade for somebody else and, maybe even come out on the wrong side of it pick-wise. I would love to have Jadeveon Clowney on the team. I just don't think that's the right move.
Yeah. Jeff, I don't know if you feel any differently, but my gut is going veteran, signing a couple, creating a pile of affordable one-year veterans is a smart way to go. There's actually a good match of talent for need here, and the risk profile is going to make it so that Seattle's a pretty good opportunity for them, and should be a win-win. I personally would like that better than giving up draft capital and then serious cap space to sign a guy like Clowney, who I don't know he's the guy that I would go to great lengths to pay.
No, that would be completely illogical. You would have been better off paying Clark, especially since you know him, the path he was on. He might command a contract bigger than Clark. He's been really tough in negotiations with the Texans. That would be a massive mistake and kind of counteract all the progress they made in this draft. And the fact that they still have pretty much all their picks for next year lined up, which is like 11 picks now, that was another big plus of this draft. But yeah, I don't see that happening. John keeps pointing to that third wave of free agency. I think he's kind of tipping off what his plan is there. He's mentioned it a bunch of times. Pete mentioned we're not done yet. I think that means it's that comp pick day, May 7th. That's when that's what they're going to do. Praying for Clowney is nuts. That makes no sense.
It's almost like May 7th is going to be Seahawks fans free agent day one of free agency day. Like that's a day that, usually Seahawks fans circle the first day of free agency and then they realize, oh yeah, we never do anything on this day. I think May 7th might be a day that there's some news to pay attention to on the free agency front for the Seahawks. So let's get back to the picks. Another position group that the team added to, and we haven't really talked about, and hadn't really talked about beforehand as much either, is linebacker. So the team added Cody Barton in the 3rd round, and they added Ben burr-kirven later on. I think he was 5th round. I'll start by just saying I don't know Barton's game that well. I've watched him play a few times. Seems like a fine player. The interesting piece that and Ben burr-kirven to me is also, I mean, he is an instinctive player. He's got some good athletic ability. I've always been watching him, wondering about his NFL career, and he just feels really undersized to me. It's hard for me to imagine him really holding up in an NFL season, but we'll see. Worst case scenario, these guys are special teamers, and can be really positive there. Best case scenario, they're part of the next wave of linebackers for this team. I'm curious, Nathan, how do you interpret the Cody Barton selection? Do you at all see that as a hedge on whether they're going to bring Bobby Wagner back?
When they just took Barton, I didn't really think too much of it. I joked about it on Twitter saying they're going to trade Bobby now, but I don't really. I mean, they're in a weird place to try to trade Bobby right now. And when you take one linebacker, when you've got one guy that might be going to jail and another guy that had a pretty lukewarm. KJ didn't have a ton of interest. They didn't pay him a ton. Maybe they're just planning for the future with that. But then to take Ben burr-kirven as well later on. I mean, he was 5th round, I think, right? And so at that point, you're just kind of going BPA probably. But it's interesting that they grabbed 2 linebackers and that it could signal that they're planning for a future without either Bobby or those other guys that could very easily not be here next year.
Jeff, what's your take on both those players? Where do you think they fit for the Seahawks now and down the road?
So at first I was a little surprised when they did move up for Barton. And the more I thought about it, it actually made a lot more sense to me. I think it's a pretty good forward-thinking move. I think that's KJ's replacement for 2020. I think that's where they see him. I think that makes sense, the kind of move that it seemed like the Patriots would make. They'd get a year early on it. Last year, how many times did we talk about Austin Collier and Mingo when those guys got hurt? And I think they viewed it the same way, that those guys just were not up to the talent of NFL players. So I look at Barton as kind of the replacement for KJ. He was durable last year. If he's not healthy or Kendricks doesn't come back, now you have him. And I looked at BBK more as an upgrade on Collier than anything on Bobby. And to me, that's important. Collier played a lot of snaps last year. That wasn't good. He got torched by Kyle Shanahan in that one game. To me, he just looks like a preseason kind of player. Doesn't look like an NFL player to me. And this guy, BBK, you guys know him better than I do. So if he's an upgrade on him, to me, that helps the roster a lot. And those are the kind of little things that really make a big difference because injuries are such a big factor there.
Well, yeah, I will say that besides adding some players, the Seahawks certainly made it tougher on us writers with DKs and LJs and Ben burr-kirvens, and my fingers were killing me this morning writing. So, I look at it and I see 2 guys that really upgrade the depth. I see, as Jeff was saying, I don't think Austin Collier is a guy that you really want on your roster. I think if he's there, that's probably an indication of some challenges you've got. And let's be really honest. I mean, I love Shaquem Griffin. He was rough at linebacker last year, like really rough. And I think that he showed a little bit on special teams, which should help him this year. They're talking about giving him some snaps at edge. But the fact that they're talking about giving him some snaps at edge is not necessarily meaning that they believe he's the answer. That might just be another indication that they don't think he's a linebacker or they don't think he's going to add as much value there. And so they're searching for where he can. That could be an indication he may not make the squad. Having Ben burr-kirven, having Cody Barton behind the other players, I think could be interesting. I hope that it's an indication that Barkevious Mingo is potentially at risk too, because Barkevious Mingo was a big special teams player last year. He was not a very good starter at Sam. And if this gives them the opportunity to move on because they have special teamers that they believe can replace what Mingo did, all the better. And then we can talk about other players taking those spots.
I think
yeah, go ahead.
Both of these guys are good players. Like they'll probably just be depth pieces this year, and then maybe they'll, I don't think Barton's going to supplant KJ until an injury happens, and that maybe feels more like a win and not an if at this point. But Barton he's another fun guy. I mean, he's quick. I think he had the fastest 3-cone in the entire combine of any player. I don't know that you really see that on the tape, but he is an athletic player. He's a stopper. He doesn't hit quite like Blair does, but like guys go backwards when he tackles them, which is a little different than burr-kirven, who finds the ball a lot, but isn't always making guys go backwards or even down all the time. So Barton's a guy that they did not take him thinking, oh, he'll just back up KJ for a couple of years. Like, I think he's a guy that's going to be a good player for them and will be a starter for them sooner than later.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that they see more than just a special teamer in Barton.
Yeah.
The highest selection they've ever spent on a linebacker was on Bobby in the second round. They haven't spent a draft pick above 4, I want to say, on a linebacker until this year. So Barton's the second highest picked linebacker by this front office. So they tend to find value at that position elsewhere or later. And so I think that is an indication they see something meaningful for him in the future. But I feel like we have really not discussed the wide receiver situation enough. There's a lot of news there. There's a lot of folks asking about it. And let's talk about it, writ large. So first, some folks are asking me, we got to talk about the Doug Baldwin tweet. What does it mean? So we'll start there by, if you haven't seen it, Doug Baldwin sent out a fantastic troll of a tweet where he basically was talking about that he wants to break the news before anybody else. And he was talking about his eight seasons and all this kind of stuff. And if you just read that tweet, you would think he's announcing his retirement. If you read his next tweet, he talks about Game of Thrones. He is just trolling you. So while I absolutely believe that Doug Baldwin probably is going to retire at some point, I don't think he's going to do it that way. And he's going to do it when he feels good and ready. That's not it. So folks that are freaking out a little bit, take a deep breath. That tweet did not mean anything about his career, but I think we all believe that he's probably not going to take another snap. So let's talk about a future where that's the case. The Seahawks took 3 receivers: DK Metcalf, Gary Jennings, and Ursua. Let's start with you, Evan. You've already got, you got Tyler Lockett, you got David Moore, you got Jaron Brown, you got Malik Turner, kind of go on down the list. Pick your 5. Let's say they usually end up going with 6, but pick your 5 Seahawks receivers that break camp with next year.
That's a really good question. I would so obviously start with Tyler Lockett. I think Metcalf makes the roster. He better make the roster. I think David Moore is in there. I think Gary Jennings is in there. And I'm struggling on my 5th. It might be Ursua, the 7th round pick. It really might. I'm a strong believer in his route running abilities. And if Doug Baldwin retires, the slot is going to be an empty void. So I think those are my 5.
Nathan, give me your 5, and give me actually, instead of giving me your 5, give me your 3 receiver set. Who's in it to start the season? Who's in it? Is it the same that ends the season? Who do you want to see out there in the 3 receiver set?
That's a good question. It's probably Lockett, Moore, and Metcalf that you want out there if you're running 11, right? I think that's probably what you want from start to finish. Of course, Ursula, Jennings, those guys working in there. would be good. But I think those are the, more taking another step in his career. Lockett is obviously Lockett, and then Metcalf, stepping up and getting good playing time this year would be the best case scenario.
What's your expectation of Metcalf? Like in that world, is he
like, what is my expectation as a player, or like in this scenario where he's, in that starting three?
What do you expect from him this year?
I don't know. I mean, so I've always been a little bit more down on Metcalf than most people did or have been. I thought he went about where he should have, where a lot of people thought, he wouldn't be available to him at 21. Obviously, I get the upside. Like, it's plain as day. He's super fast. He's a huge human being. He's, got a lot of potential, and he can be a lot of fun. But that said, there's a lot of question marks with him. He's had health issues. He didn't produce, which is pretty concerning. And, had concentration drops. Not a really well-developed receiver at this point. Even John and I think Pete were pretty open about that and what he was asked to do at LSU. Obviously, the sky's the limit for him, but he's a big question mark. I think that fans should really temper their expectations for him, especially early on.
Well, I'll ask you this now. I'm gonna go to you, Jeff. When you say temper your expectations, give me an over/under. Do you think that I'll give you on David Moore's numbers from last year? Okay, tell me if you think that it's reasonable to expect more or less of this than DK Metcalf. So Moore had 26 catches for 445 yards, 17-yard average, and 5 touchdowns. Do you think DK Metcalf does better than that, worse than that, roughly the same?
If we get that from DK this year, I think that'll be a good year. I think that I wouldn't expect a lot more than that from him.
Jeff, what's your take on how this receiver group has been reshaped? How are you expecting it to play out?
Yeah, I was very positively, but I guess enthused by the whole thing, because I think we were all kind of worried based on, I don't know if it was the coaching staff or John, I can't remember who said it, but there was a lot of positive comments coming out about Jerron Brown at some point earlier in the offseason, how they need to give him more time because his touchdown numbers were pretty high. I can't think it was Pete who said that. So I was a little worried that they were buying a little too much into unsustainable touchdown numbers, and Brown didn't really show much outside of that. So to see them invest 2 pretty high picks in receiver really showed that they saw receiver as a similar need as us, and which the Seahawks offensively have not gone that way at all in recent years. We've read their team very differently than they have. So I was pretty enthused by that. I think I'm more along the lines with Evan, where his 5 receivers. I think Patrick Turner's got a shot to be the 5th guy there, and maybe they keep Brown around if they have this extra cap room.
Did you mean Malik Turner?
Yeah, Malik Turner. I don't know Patrick Turner. I think he used to play USC.
Yeah.
Yeah, Malik Turner. My bad. He showed a little bit last year. I think he might be in the 5th guy, but Evan's right that they need some slot options. I think the problem that worries me still is I think the splits last year when Baldwin wasn't on the field was how different their third down numbers were. And Russell really needs to be comfortable with his receivers. Rookies tend to develop a little slower in today's NFL. It's just a big learning curve, especially a team that passes as little as Seattle does. So that's the part of the team that still worries me on paper. It's a really fun group. There's a lot of upside. Metcalf's going to be great to watch despite some of his raw skills. But I'm worried about who's the third down guy, because when Baldwin left the field last year and he wasn't around, they really had trouble on the third and 5 to 8 kind of plays. They don't have that intermediate guy right now, and they have a lot of long speed, but that's what still worries me without really adding on tight end either.
Yeah, that is absolutely a good point. I think everyone appreciates Doug Baldwin, and I know that he's got a lot of fans. I still don't know that people really understand how good of a player he is relative to other receivers in the NFL and across Seahawks history. And not only was he physically gifted, but he was incredibly heady in terms of how to find the spots and how to get open. So, as good as Tyler Lockett is, I don't think you've yet seen him be that guy on third down that is finding the soft spots continuously and making the clutch catch in those situations. So there's going to be a third down question. I would say, not surprising, none of you mentioned Amara Darboh, although he's getting plenty of mentions in the chat. I don't think any of us believe that Darboh has a shot to make this team, or he would have proven something up until now. I think, look, I guess I'd put it this way. Jerron Brown for me is probably 7th or 8th on the depth chart in terms of who I'd want to keep on the team. And I really think that I almost feel more concerned that the team will force him on the roster as wanting some more experience and potentially leave one of these younger players at risk of getting scooped up somewhere else. And I think that would be a big mistake. But, I'm fond of Jennings. I think Moore, you guys know I'm high on Moore, and I think Moore is going to take a big step forward. It's his 3rd season. I think he saw the field last year. I think he's ready to take that next step. So that's the guy that I'm expecting to be number 2. And then, I think it's going to be interesting between Metcalf and Jennings. Would not surprise me at all if Jennings was the one that ends up emerging as the initial guy getting the snaps on the outside. And Metcalf, is a 4th receiver type of player. Ursua is definitely an interesting player who could challenge in the slot. Like, I think that's definitely one to watch. So he and Keenan Reynolds will go back and forth, but Keenan Reynolds got some chances for a few years. I just don't know that I see him. I don't know that I'd bet on him all of a sudden turning it around or turning it loose this year. So as we're going to have to start wrapping up here, let's just talk about grades, guys. Give me your, we gave some offseason grades before. Give me 2 grades. Give me your grade on the offseason to date, with where the team started at the end of the season, and give me your grade on the draft in particular. Evan, let's start with you.
Offseason as a total, I think it's a clear A. I think, and that's not just me being my optimistic self. I think they did a really good job throughout free agency. They let their guys walk, and some of them get a little bit overpaid. I think the whole Frank Clark trade was brilliant. I think they got incredibly strong compensation in return for that. I think they protected their comp picks super well, and they didn't overspend on anybody, really. I thought the kicker position, addressing that, was brilliant. I am so glad we finally have a good kicker. The analytics nerds can hide in their caves. We have a goddamn good kicker, and I'm so freaking excited about it. So they made that wrong right. I'm so happy about that kicker spot. Jason Myers is going to be a stud for the Seahawks. Super excited about that. The draft, I'd probably be like B+. I thought they moved down a little bit too far from 21 to 30. If they had picked up Sweat, I think instead of LJ Collier, I think I would have been a lot more positive about the edge rush. But I'm a little bit concerned about that position group. But overall, I think the draft was a stunning success, and John Schneider absolutely finessed like a few, GMs. So I think it's a good deal. I genuinely believe this is like one of the best off seasons we've had in quite a few years.
Jeff, how about you? Grade for the off season, grade for the draft.
I'm going to sound a lot like Evan here, but I'm going to give it an A. And if they add more edge players, I'm willing to go A+. I've been particularly hard on John in recent years, and even heading into this offseason. I think this is him kicking ass for the first time probably since 2012, maybe that's 2013. First, the Seahawks didn't do anything alarmingly stupid, which for them the last couple of years has jumped off the page. There's been so many moves, just going from not signing dumb contracts in free agency. We can talk about the kickers, maybe one of them, but they've talked about the comp picks. They realized their mistakes from last year. The Russell Wilson deal is just, we can't reiterate how big that is. That just kind of set the tone for everything. I was so down on where they were 2-3 weeks ago. I would have probably given it a C. And getting Russell Wilson done, trading Frank. Like, you go back to that article where we all wrote like things we want to see improve. They've hit almost all of them now, other than maybe being more like progressive passing wise, but which we can't see till the season. I guess they didn't fire Shoddy, so that's maybe not an A+. But when you look at the draft was John's best work in such a long time. That trade tree you did, Brian, was so cool. And to see him turn 21 into that, the 6 players, that's what John does. That's his best skill. In terms of the players they brought in the draft, it'd probably be somewhere like a B into that high profile. I'd give it maybe a B because I don't think they hit that high profile guy, like that real impact guy. But it's kind of like last year's draft without Penny and actually a good use of a first round pick. And there's just players throughout the draft. And just in terms of the overall draft, I'd give it an A minus because of the value, because of the trades. So in terms of talent, B. In terms of overall draft performance, I go A minus. Overall offseason, A.
How about you, Nathan?
Basically the exact same. A for the overall offseason. I wish they would have gotten Robert Quinn. I wish they would have beaten Dallas on that offer. I wish they would not have given Myers that contract because it just wasn't very smart. The draft was an A minus for me. Obviously, a lot of that is based on the trades back, and the amount of picks that they were able to acquire going from 4 to 11 is no joke. Especially, making a really bold move. They didn't have a bold pickup, but they had a big bold move in trading Clark. So that was really cool for them to do. And then, one of the guys that we didn't even talk about in terms of like the players that they got is Phil Haynes. And that guy could be starting guard at the end of the year, right? They picked up some receivers. I don't love them all. I'm a little tepid actually on the talent that they got at the receiver. But they threw a lot against the wall. Obviously they took some high upside guys, so that's all good. Yeah, it's hard to find much to really beat down on, like the contract, like the Myers contract. I wish they wouldn't have done that. It's not crippling by any stretch, right? Collier is a little underwhelming, but I think he's a good player. So I think that they just had a really, really, really solid offseason. Did just about everything right, and yeah, it was really cool to see.
Yeah, I mean, there's other players we didn't talk about as well. We didn't talk about Amadi. We didn't talk about Christmas. We didn't talk about the player, not the holiday, and didn't talk about Homer either. So there's an interesting couple moves there. But my grade for the offseason right now is A minus. I think that it's incomplete until we finish out what's going on with the defensive line. I think it's tough to. Every choice they've made has given me more confidence and renewed my faith in this organization. I wouldn't have wanted them so far to pretty much do anything differently other than the kicker contract. And I'm not, I'm not going to spend too much time worrying about that because, as Nathan said, it's not too crippling. I don't think it's good business. But that's the story for me, is that they've made good choice after good choice, and they've also made some moves that I don't know that any of us thought either A, that they would be willing to do, and B, capable of doing. And this is things like the Russell contract, the Frank trade, the letting go of guys in free agency that were going to be tempting to bring back, the not signing stupid guys that were going to cost them comp picks, like the trade back and then the trade back some more and turning what was a negative in that 21st pick and in their first trade into what was clearly a positive in terms of what they got back in return. They've got a second round pick still out of all those deals for next year that hasn't even come to pass. So as far as the draft goes, for me, it's an A. It's a solid A. I think for what you can judge it by right now, I think it's an A. I actually think that there's potential for a lot of upside here, and I think it's on the receiver side. I'm pretty high on those guys, as I said before. It will be interesting. I would not say that the Seahawks have had to develop a lot of receivers. The receivers they've got that have played well have been pretty developed as they came. So I think Doug Baldwin was Doug Baldwin when he got here. I think Tyler Lockett was Tyler Lockett when he got here. There aren't as many examples of them taking raw talent and harnessing it at the receiver position, partially because they haven't been a team that's really looked, to be heavy on the passing game. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do with that talent and whether they're going to take the steps to utilize it, which, I know a lot of folks are going to be looking at and there's going to be a lot of cynicism about. So story of this offseason for me was when they made that Russell Wilson signing. I think the whole franchise turned on that night. And I think this draft was just further proof that they're building around him, and this is going to be Russell's team. And I think we're going to see that in terms of how they run the offense as well. I don't think it's going to be as pass heavy as some folks want or as innovative as some folks want, but I do think that it's going to there's going to be significantly more emphasis on getting to balance than there was last year. So, any closing thoughts you guys have before we wrap here? Evan, you unmuted.
Go get a veteran pass rusher, and we're heading really well into the season. I'm super excited about it. They've got money to spend. John Schneider, take out your credit card.
Yeah, I'm going to take one more minute on that note. Assuming that they sign a couple pass rushers, pick whichever your favorite, doesn't matter. Anyone here feel like the Seahawks would be, at that point, better or worse than they were when the season ended last year? Given all the moves, do you feel like the Seahawks at that point would be better or worse than they were at the end of last year?
I think they're going to
start with
you. Worse. I think losing Clark, even though the right thing to do, is obviously a big hit from talent perspective this year, and even an 80% Doug Baldwin is a pretty good player, and they might not have that. Sounds like they probably won't have that, and they're gonna be pretty raw at receivers. So I think that on talent they're probably worse.
Jeff?
Yeah, I agree with that to an extent. I think you lose your best defender from last year, arguably, and I guess Bobby might have been. We've talked about Doug so much on the show. Losing him is just a major blow, but the key thing for them is they're just so much better positioned long-term from where they were last year. We've barely talked about safety. We've hammered safety all. It's such a more competitive group now, both at free safety and strong safety. In the short term, they are probably worse. Russell might not put up the efficiency numbers he did, but again, they're so much better positioned for the future. They got another 11 picks coming. That's what's most important. They looked like they were heading nowhere after last year. To me, that's the big story.
And Evan.
Yeah, pass rush and I think nickel corner are the issues. Justin Coleman obviously was a big signing with the Lions, $9.5 million a year. I think they're thinking that hoping that Akeem King can take that spot and run with it. But yeah, they're probably worse off talent-wise in the short term. But there's a lot of opportunity for some guys, even drafted from not just this year, but last year, to step into some really pivotal roles. And if, Rasheem Green or Jacob Martin start stepping up and producing big time, who knows? This could be like the short to medium term where they could be a much better team. So it'll be super interesting to watch unfold.
Yeah, I'll go really quickly through through the roster, or at least position group. I think safety-wise, I think they're much better than they were last year, where they ended last year. So I feel good about that. I think corner certainly would have liked them to add more to the pile, but and I think the loss of Coleman's big. So I think they're even with last year, given the amount of guys they've got to potentially replace Coleman. I think that they're about the same place. They could be even a little bit better if Flowers continues to develop and Shaquille Griffin rebounds from a down year. Linebacker, I think they're going to be better. I think they're better at that position. And I think defensive line, if they sign the two pass rushers, I believe that defensive line could be better overall. We saw, down year from Rasheem Green, in terms of where he was. And anyway, I think that there's more upside to be had on the defensive line, especially if they get some vets that if Ansah signs and he can play, two huge ifs, but if that happens, I think he's every bit Frank Clark as a pass rusher, if not more in some cases. So, I think that could be a huge get. Flipping over to the offensive side, I think they're super strong at running back. I think they are strong. I think the receiver thing's real. I mean, Doug, though, the piece that I'd say there is I think people forget Doug Baldwin was basically not playing for the first 3 quarters of that season. Like, he was barely being targeted. He was barely part of the offense. The first part of the season, he wasn't even playing. He came on at the end of the year, made a big difference, but it's questionable how much they relied on him last year. And then tight end should be better if Disley's healthy. And an offensive line, I think, is at least a push. You could argue maybe it's in a little bit better shape. So, as I quickly run through it, and I think special teams should be in better shape as well. I think there's the case to be made that the team will be at least as good as last year from a talent perspective if they sign those rushers. And once we get into camp and see what these rookies look like and what the developing players from last year look like, could be really exciting. So with that, folks, if you haven't already, please leave a review on iTunes or Google Play just for the podcast. It's great to let more people know. Just let someone know about the show. It's a great way to get more viewers. And as you know, we donate a bunch of money to charity every year that we get from the pod and from Hawk Blogger in general. It's $20,000 this year that we donated to Ben's fund, over $120,000 overall in our history. So we get that from you guys sharing about the pod, from joining up at patreon.com/hawkblogger. Please subscribe if you haven't already, either here on YouTube or at any of your favorite podcasting locations. And keep an eye out. We will get some fun clips and other things going here as we pick up. Our next pod will likely be a week from Wednesday or something along that line. Keep an eye out on the site. Best chance is to subscribe so you'll know and get notified when we add a new event. Otherwise, have a great rest of your Sunday and go Hawks.